that pop up during the presentation, please let me know in real time. I'm happy to answer them that way. All right, so there are kind of three main topics that I'll be going through tonight in the presentation. The first is kind of defining this concept of emergency e-learning. I think it is very important that when we're having these conversations around the response to COVID-19 in the higher education space, that we don't conflate online learning courses that were designed, or perhaps even entire programs that were designed to be online, on the one hand, and this emergency response on the other hand. As we all know, COVID has changed a lot of things, but it's changed the way that we prepare for online courses when we thought we may have been giving them in person, and then there's a very kind of rapid transition that doesn't follow, and there's no way for it to follow, the best practices of online course development. So that will be the first piece in the presentation tonight. The second will compare the COVID-19 response and the emergency e-learning in the COVID-19 context to other emergency e-learning programs. Then third, I'm going to turn to different ongoing and future research directions on emergency e-learning and COVID, but also emergency e-learning more broadly considered. This is partially related to a forum that I'm editing with a colleague, and we're bringing perspectives from across United States, Canada, as well as a couple of other countries to kind of see how is emergency e-learning and COVID-19 having a different effect on different kinds of institutions, different geographical situations, different different student bodies, and so on. The bulk of this presentation, kind of the first two sections, come out of this article that I wrote that was published in late April on, oh, thank you, yep. Thank you for sharing that link to the publication list. Specifically, the first two sections here are going to focus on this article that I wrote on COVID-19 and emergency e-learning consequences of the securitization of higher education for post-pandemic pedagogy. This was published as part of a quick response forum for the journal Contemporary Security Policy. And I looked at, what can the discipline of security studies tell us about the institutional responses to COVID-19. I went through and did a content analysis of the official declarations of emergency e-learning and found that there was a framing of not only COVID-19 as a security threat, but also having face-to-face classes. So it was that mode of instruction that was identified as a security threat, which obviously isn't kind of how we understand face-to-face classes outside of the COVID context. So I looked at, what kinds of policy limitations does this place upon our decisions for the spring term, summer term, fall term, kind of moving forward as we get into preparations for a second wave, but also as we look towards a post-pandemic pedagogy. What does the choice to frame face-to-face education as a security threat pose, in terms of institutional policy, educational policy, and so on. So if you're interested in that, I'd encourage you to check that out. If you have any comments on that, I've got my email later on in the slide deck, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, especially because we do have a number of different institutional experiences at the table tonight. So we'll move into the first section here, and highlighted at the bottom I have just a very simple statement that all of my research into the COVID-19 emergency e-learning experience has just doubled my belief in this statement, that emergency e-learning is not the same as rich online learning that we have as instructors, we have the opportunity to create for that particular purpose. Emergency e-learning I define as the rapid transition of face-to-face classes to online learning systems in response to extraordinary times. That's really the core of what we found in a number of institutions across the world in responding to COVID-19. We had a rapid transition because of this, what's often called the unprecedented threat of COVID-19. In the paper, I get into more detail on why the cohort and cluster transmissions were of particular concern on the university campus, especially well, both commuter campuses and residential campuses. There are slightly different reasons between the two, but the fact that there are possibilities for cluster transmission and transmission between asymptomatic carriers and the rest of the community that posed a specifically a threat specifically for the face-to-face classroom context. We found that a number, and anyone who's followed different institutional responses on Twitter even would have seen this, that there were professors who ran synchronous online courses through the emergency e-learning period. Follow-up interviews that I've done have indicated that a lot of the time this resulted in lower course attendance or posed an extra burden onto certain students, especially if they had parental or other kinds of care responsibilities, if there were limits to access to the e-learning platform, internet connection, a number of devices in the home or something like that. Asynchronous learning also poses its challenges because, again, this isn't, the emergency e-learning responses weren't fully developed online learning platforms where you could have that kind of rich asynchronous discussion, but instead these were often developed either on the fly or a couple of days in advance through no fault of anyone's really. That was just the hand that we were all dealt. So planning in the emergency e-learning context is done as a temporary measure or as a transitional measure. So by temporary measure, that encompasses those institutions that are now looking towards the fall and saying, okay, we're going to have classes in person from the beginning of the term until, well, so I'm speaking from Canada, so Thanksgiving, that's early October for us. Or we're going to be online until Thanksgiving, and then maybe we'll go back face-to-face. And those kinds of stopgap measures, while it may be more attractive for recruiting students or retaining students so that they don't go on a gap year or something that would lead to a budget issue for the institution, it really does hamper the ability of instructors to design robust online learning experiences that would be planned just the same as if they were face-to-face courses. As part of preparing this research project, I looked at, what are the best practices out there? How long does it take to develop a fully online course? And there was a web page with that exact title, which was wonderful. So this is from the SUNY Broome Community College, and they suggest, along with kind of best practices in the educational development and instructional design literature, that 5 months is a good development timeline for a new online course. After that, I wondered, okay, well, how much time did institutions actually have in their COVID-19 transition? So I looked at a comparative sample of the 45 top-ranked Canadian institutions by Maclean's magazine, and then the Wall Street Journal rankings of 45 institutions in the United States. So first I looked at, okay, when were these decisions made to make an e-learning, emergency e-learning transition, and found that there wasn't really that much variation. We see one that's very early on the 6th of March because of a case on that particular campus. And then we see a couple of later ones here on the 17th and 19th of March. And those were because classes had been canceled earlier and emergency e-learning was announced at a second announcement. So really, we're talking about a week. And in a 1 week period, the top 45 schools in both countries announced these emergency e-learning transitions. But there was a bit of variation over how much time these institutions had to prepare. Typically, it was about a week and a half, or that was the most common transition period. But there really was a bit of variety here between 1 day and close to a month. But neither one of these were anywhere near the best practice suggestion of 5 months. I think it's pretty safe to say that whether you're looking at a 1-day transition or a 26-day transition, the winter term switch did not allow for any kind of fully developed and rich online learning experience, because it was this turnaround where we wanted to mitigate the risk of credit loss in that quarter or semester, and just finish the term in as strong a way as possible. Often the winter term emergency e-learning announcement was matched with a spring and summer term or quarter announcement that would also fall under emergency e-learning. So these courses falling into that group had about 2 or 3 months preparation, which is still not 5 months, but it's a little bit better. So you're able to think about how you would fit in different elements to, I was delighted to hear the professor at the beginning of this course talk about making that human connection and thinking about how we can make not just the best of the situation in a kind of efficiency sense, but also in a humanity sense, that we're looking at seeing how we can make this a richer and more personal experience. The other takeaway point from when these announcements happened is that if we had announced fall terms being online in March, that would mean for almost all institutions, you are able to have close to that full window for course transition. Now, transferring all of your courses is, it's a tougher ask than just transitioning one course at a time, but it would have that window to fit in with best practice in instructional design. So that, I'm not sure if there are any questions right now just on that first piece of what is emergency e-learning, how is it different from online learning, but if you'd like to put those in the chat, I'd be happy to answer them, or if you want to turn your microphone on and ask, then that's fine as well.
Now, Michael, I think you said you were in your PhD program, so I don't want to leave it out of turn. What would you prefer me to address you as?
Oh, just Michael's fine.
Okay, Michael.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to know, so when you're talking about this, because I was driving and listening, when you're talking about this emergency e-learning and best practices, are you talking about the transitioning from face-to-face to online, including synchronous and non-synchronous programs? Or I was trying to kind of narrow down on what best practices are. Is it all about the transition and how it's done? Is that what you're speaking in context of here?
So I think that one of the, thank you for that question. I think one of the big issues is we don't know what the best practices are for emergency e-learning. This is really the first time that there's been an online shift at this scale.
Yeah.
And so when I say best practices, or when I have said best practices up until now, my point is that if you were developing that kind of full, rich online learning experience for a course, say a course in 2018, like pre-COVID, if I'm developing a course, the best practice in the instructional design literature would suggest that you need 5 months to do that. As far as the actual pedagogical tools, I think that's still very much up for discussion. There are debates on barriers to access when there are multiple courses that a person or a household may have scheduled at the same time. So that, that's an argument against synchronous. But on the other hand, there are mental health experts who are saying if we have only asynchronous options for education, then we're going to miss out on that social connection, and there could be mental health consequences that we will have no way of anticipating, appreciating, and supporting. So I think that is, it's going to come up later on when I talk about the questions that are still very much out there for future research. Because while we have a best practice in the limited sense of how much time does it take to develop that rich online learning experience, we really don't know what our pandemic pedagogy should look like.
I see. Thank you.
I could just add a couple of things. This is Terry Kotkowitz. Now, I am a professor who's taught online and face-to-face. And what's nice in the academic community is oftentimes, teachers, especially adjuncts, they don't always get that 3 months to prepare or longer. So what we do is share our shell courses that they can modify it any way they wish. But like we use the Canvas learning management system. So we'll just literally copy it over into their course, and then the adjuncts can change it any way they want. So that's what it seemed for this emergency learning. That's what we seem to have done with our many of our online classes. And then just another idea too, I was teaching the same course online as I was face-to-face. And you talk about richness of the academic experience, but it's really the student that, there's a reason why students don't like online classes, that whether they're not motivated to do it on their own, or, maybe they're not exactly strong readers so that they get so much more from face-to-face. So I felt going synchronous, and since it was, we had classes 3 days a week, I said, you know what, we're going to have Zoom classes 2 days a week. I'll give you off on Friday. And I actually had very high attendance, that because there was a reason why the students didn't want to do online, that they like the face-to-face and the interaction together. So just thought I'd share that with you.
Yeah, thank you. There are a number of different considerations that go into both the individual class circumstance. Planning for a lecture of 500 or 600 students is going to look very different than the decisions you make for a smaller seminar. Also institutional context and other considerations like that. Thank you both for sharing your comments and questions. And I'd like to move now into the second section of the presentation.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Yes.
Michaels? I just want to differentiate between online teaching and remote teaching, because I really believe that the urgency to move classes, what we are considering online, was really an urgency to move classes remote teaching. Because bringing a class to remote teaching is the Zoom communication and things like that. Whereas when you have a complete quality matter certified course online, that's a very different presentation than what is required to our response, I think, to COVID. So I've taught online and I've taught remotely. So we refer to our transition and response to COVID more of a remote teaching, because we were not able to respond in a way that would allow us the time to really develop our coursework to be a quality matter certified course online. Is that what we're like? Are we referring more to remote teaching, or are we referring to online classes?
Thank you for that question, because I do share the concern with having precise terminology here. There are different ways that the terms online and remote are used, even in these specific policy announcements, when one would think that it is of utmost importance to be consistent. So that is why I have suggested in my article that we use this term of emergency e-learning to describe that suite of responses that institutions are bringing forward into their planning for COVID response. For some, I share your skepticism that there are full certified and approved online programs that were developed, over the course of one day or even 20 some days, but there are different ways that institutions use those phrases: online learning and remote learning. It doesn't always refer to a particular certification scheme. So to get away from those terms that have particular institutional baggage, I've suggested this term of emergency e-learning to kind of capture what we're talking about here in asynchronous and synchronous modalities, but without using those kinds of terms that are technical at some institutions and not technical at other institutions. But I do appreciate that, because there are those different meanings associated, that applying the emergency e-learning research to your particular your particular research project or your particular institutional context will have very different ramifications. So I thank you for the point. Personally, I am going to stick with emergency e-learning, but if that term doesn't fit your institutional experience, then by all means use the term that is most specific and best able to support an informed discussion at your institution. One thing that I found, even just from watching cable news coverage of COVID-19 as the kind of general health situation was being announced, is there was a lot of framing of COVID-19 as a pandemic without a precedent, an unprecedented threat to society and health, and things simply like that. I think that in the case of education particularly, this might be a place where we ignored the history that would have been there to help us. There have been small examples historically where emergency e-learning protocols were introduced in response to SARS. There were a small number of online learning platforms that rolled out at Hong Kong University, although this hasn't been really recognized in the, at least the English instructional development literature. Contingency plans for H1N1 just over a decade ago saw around 2/3 of American institutions prepare for a transition to emergency e-learning if that second wave necessitated it in that circumstance, although that was not, of course, rolled out in the same way that the COVID response was. But I think it's also important to consider other kinds of precedents, and particularly natural disasters. You'll find in the literature some examples of, say, an earthquake in a particular community means that it's not safe to go outside for one class. So there's 1 week that's shifted online, or a couple of weeks that are shifted online. But a much larger scale, and probably the closest precedent for the COVID-19 emergency e-learning, happened in response to Hurricane Katrina. So there were 27 colleges damaged in the Gulf region, in addition to institutions in Texas that were hit as well in this path. And this included places like Delgado Community College, where 20 of 25 buildings on campus were destroyed and could not be used. Wouldn't be safe to stand in for too long, let alone to hold classes. So a response from the Sloan Foundation and a consortium of 153 colleges and universities around the United States rallied together to create an online learning catalog where there were a number of, a high number of online courses available to students in affected areas. There's been a little bit of literature. If you type, Sloan semester into Google Scholar, you will find there was a special issue of a journal that's dedicated to online and remote learning that looked at different aspects of the Sloan semester experience. But it was, really not something that we talked about in planning for the COVID-19 response. So one question that's kind of in the back of my mind as I look at the big picture, hindsight being 2020, why was there no Sloan semester or something like that for COVID-19? We all knew that there would be different barriers, different pressures that institutions would be facing without different revenue streams being affected, and with new expenditures that were necessary to set up for physical distancing on campus, new staff, retraining, redesign of some buildings or protocols, and that would mean this kind of coordination, or some level of coordination with increased opportunity to register at other institutions, may have helped to alleviate the pressures that were faced at each institution. Again, this is very much an open question. It's a counterfactual. We don't know what would happen. We don't know really why there was no Sloan semester for COVID-19, except that there wasn't. Institutions largely stayed within their system or within their campus for a single campus institution. That led to a little bit of disorganization and made it harder for those kinds of bold, forward-looking decisions to be made on canceling ahead of time, because there was still some competition for student tuition dollars in future semesters. I'll just pause again here. So I know that this was the shorter of the three sections, but are there any questions or other precedents from your campuses of emergency e-learning or online learning responses?
I think that's a great information. I think Melbourne has not done in details of like this. They are simply, creating remote learning courses. In those that we did have online courses, the programs, I didn't see much impacted by the COVID-19. Is they moved in a smooth transitions. Although yes, there were some challenges and issues, but there was a smooth transition. The cases with the community college might be different. And scholars, please unmute your microphone if you have a questions. So Michael is happy to answer your questions. If not, then we move forward. Okay, looks like there are no additional questions.
All right. There we go. So the final topic that I'd like to talk about here is the ongoing and future research. Now, a lot of this is being coordinated at the institutional level. Again, although there is, so in the Canadian context, there are some public research institutions and think tanks that are looking at how we can learn from one another at this time and in preparation for a second wave. And in my personal case, editing a forum that's looking at these different questions about pandemic pedagogy, post-pandemic pedagogy, what we have to learn from the winter, what we can learn moving into the fall, and so on. And I'd like to suggest that there are kind of three types of questions that we'll be asking about emergency e-learning as we move forward. The first is the assessment of standard practice. So this is going back to the question earlier from one of our colleagues on the call. What is the best practice? What is the best way to handle these emergency e-learning situations? Is it synchronous? Is it asynchronous? Do we try to continue if we have to change mid-semester? Do we try to find a creative solution that would allow students to switch from synchronous to asynchronous if their particular section of a course was going in one direction rather than the other? And then the second, going to those, both the counterfactual, the what if we had a Sloan semester, but also explorations of innovative solutions that perhaps didn't happen at the major institutions of higher education that we're always talking about. And how did those non-standard and alternative response models work better or perhaps not as well as the response strategies that are always in the news. Third, one thing that I've been speaking to our research team about is how it's important to include questions of underlying dynamics in our future research about emergency e-learning, even if those questions aren't directly framed in emergency e-learning, kind of where the questions are coming from. It's important to recognize that inequalities, barriers, and access issues that don't arise specifically because of emergency e-learning will still be there. And we can't forget the issues that we have in the ordinary world just because we're in this extraordinary time. So I'll go through and have a brief discussion of each of these three types of questions for future research. I'd be really interested, because this is a group of individuals from a number of different institutions, if you have specific examples from your institutional context, your research, prior research experience, or even your experience as a student, I would be delighted to hear where you think these questions should go, and I'll take that back to our research team. So within this assessment of standard practice group of questions, I look at this research that's coming out talking about issues that became especially important in the COVID context, but a 2020 publication means that you started your data collection in 2017, 2018. And to see issues of laptop ownership predicting student achievement, tech dependability predicting student achievement, how were these effects compounded by COVID, both as a health crisis, and how were these issues impacted by emergency e-learning? If you don't have a laptop and you now need a laptop, more than ever, and your institution's computer lab has been declared a security threat and it is now closed. How does that added access issue impact your experience as a student?
I was really surprised. I'm sorry, was it time for responses?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, sorry. I was really surprised to find out just the amount of students who attend Baltimore City Community College, where I work, that didn't have laptops at home or a desktop computer or reliable internet access. I expected it to be a few people, but not the amount of people that it actually is. So this is definitely, it has been a huge issue for students having to go 100% online due to COVID. We've been able to supply some students with, what do you call it? Not their laptops, but their, the Google, well, it's not a laptop, but it's like a notebook, if you know what I mean.
Chromebooks, I guess.
Yeah, we were able to supply them with some of those. Chromebooks, that's what it was. Thank you. We were able to supply them with Chromebooks, but not really do much for the internet access.
One of the things that my district had to do was to offer free hotspots for the students, so they could get internet access, and there were emergency funds made available with COVID-19 for students that had emergency financial needs, whether it was for computer equipment or rent or food scarcity or whatever it is the students were experiencing. We were able to get some funds together for that. But even with providing them, my early high school students were the most profoundly affected because the high schools had provided them with Chromebooks, but then there were compatibility issues with them actually being able to utilize those Chromebooks and get full access to whatever platforms were used in conjunction with Blackboard. We use Blackboard. Whatever software was used in conjunction with that by the publishers, there were issues with the Chromebook having access, and so there are layers of issues that come into play technologically for students that are not financially capable to have what we think is a normal everyday thing.
Thank you for bringing that point forward. What I always am struck by in conversations like this about internet and technology access is this finding from a Pew survey from a few years ago that found when you look at American households with an income of $30,000 or less, 1 in 3 students living in a household of income $30,000 or less will not have access to internet that is fast enough to complete online assignments.
That's right. And
that is before we have issues of massive job loss related to COVID-19. So, I think that we really need to think about how these access issues compound in the context of COVID-19. I saw that there were a couple of other microphones that were unmuted. I'll mute myself again so that if anyone else has something to share, you're very much welcome to do so.
I wanted to share really quickly because I'm in the K-12 field right now, and our students, we were able to provide them all with Microsoft Surface Go devices and Wi-Fi. It was donated by the DC Education Fund. And looking at your second bullet about the positive student-teacher relationship support, student mental health. That was essential for our students because although we were able to provide them with the resources, they didn't necessarily want them. They also dealt with the response to COVID. So although we shifted to ensure that they had what they needed, the students still needed a little bit more. They had the access, but they didn't necessarily want to engage. And so that was another part that we struggled with because we were able to provide them with the resources, whether they had them or not. And I mean, we even drove some devices to their homes and things of that nature for the students that couldn't get to our school to pick it up. But they weren't actually engaged in the work. And so that positive student, and I wouldn't even say just teacher, but that student and staff member relationship is really important. And just in this program, I know that I'm a little behind, but with the discussion of asynchronous versus synchronous learning, I feel like the students in my cohort, we are completely online, and that's what we, have been used to. And so the way that we've responded to learning is a little bit different, but I think that COVID hit us all. And there is a necessity for ensuring that the practices that happen at the ground level, at the school level, also happens online. Like it's almost mirrored, because I know that we did not get a break at all when COVID hit. And so although we have access to the resources, we're used to the online learning, there was an aspect of, I feel like a little bit of oversight when it came to ensuring that we were able to pause, if even for a couple of days or a week, to adjust our lives to what was happening. So that relationship piece is key, whether you're asynchronous or synchronous learning.
And there was one last thing I wanted to pipe in, Michael, that to be considered. Unfortunately, community college students are quite often unprepared for the college level. And so now you have a student that's unprepared for the college level, and a student that you really have to sort of hang on to and make all of the services available to be able to help the student to be retained and succeed. And now with the social distancing that online learning brings, you can have a student-teacher relationship with a student, but how do we support the students that are underprepared for the classroom to even bring them? Now we're asked to bring them to an even higher level of learning, where they have to learn online, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous. So I think that's something to be considered.
I agree.
And actually, that's where my college comes in through our engagement coaching, that we offer it free for all students. And basically, it's not advising, but it's just helping them get from point A to point B. It's kind of an interesting program.
Okay, great. We can take maybe one more question. We're almost on the top of the hours. And maybe we can take one more last question.
Okay, I could also just push into just kind of push through the last two slides that I have in here, just in case maybe some of the questions might be answered in those two. So the second one that I had mentioned a bit, talking about the Sloan semester, is, what kind of non-standard and alternative models might work or might have worked if we would have been allowed to, find innovative solutions. Perhaps that wouldn't be the easiest thing to do in our particular institutional context, but, thinking big, getting ready for the second wave or future threats, whether natural disasters or a future pandemic or any other kinds of issues that we might face, it's important to think about which faculty training model worked best. What would, going out into the field, getting interviews with instructors who had these experiences, what would an ideal faculty training model look like? Again, that's probably going to look very different at a community college than it would at at a major research university. It's going to look, different at a rural campus than an urban campus. And all of these different kinds of institutions that aren't, the ones that media coverage and bloggers look to. What can everyone learn from those alternative and non-standard or non-dominant models of emergency e-learning, staff training, capacity building, and so on? And on the more technical side, what efficiencies can we exploit by larger institutional licenses, maybe consortia of different schools going into the market with that extra purchasing power to get a bit of expenditure relief through larger licensing. And finally, I think that what gets lost in the focus on emergency e-learning as this kind of extraordinary event is that we risk losing sight of the underlying dynamics that are there each and every day, whether it's an emergency situation or the so-called normal situation. A lot of underlying dynamics will be impacted quite negatively so that there's a disproportionate burden placed on particular communities within schools through the emergency e-learning experience that we're already facing an undue and inequitable burden in that so-called ordinary condition. So I think that when we look at emergency e-learning research, it can't just be about that piece of what is new in this situation, but it should be a broader discussion about how does emergency e-learning reveal what was already a problem, what was already an unjust barrier, an unnecessary inequality, and how can we both support communities that were unsupported this time around in the e-learning context whenever the next threat happens, but how can we also build a more equitable, emancipatory system for that, ordinary condition? I guess I've been doing air quotes and my video is off, so I guess people haven't been able to see those except for my neighbors. But that so-called ordinary condition, what are we missing when we typically look at instructional design in those times, and how can emergency e-learning maybe help us to reflect on those issues? I'm happy to take questions. I'm not sure what kind of time constraint we're on right now, but if you'd like to email me, or I've seen people putting Twitter information up. So if you'd like to connect with me somehow to share your thoughts, future questions, either things that I wasn't clear about tonight, or questions that you think I should have a look at as I continue this research into emergency e-learning, I'd be happy to hear from you.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciated. This is a great information. And in fact, you touched all major key concepts that we are going to unfold in our course, Technology in Higher Education, teaching, learning, student services, and then other software that, and then also the leadership role of university, college presidents, deans, provosts. These are also involved or also explored in our course. So thank you. We appreciate for willing to speak with my students all the way to at least 900 miles away from here. Thank you. This is very eye-opening presentation. I do have a question for you. You have, in an early career scholar, you produce more than a tenured professor produced. So I'm not hesitant to call you Dr. Murphy. In last 3 years, you produce almost 25, 30 manuscript, published, and they are highly cited. Even the one on this screen, my scholar can see is already viewed, downloaded, or the views is more than 15,000. So this is really amazing. And I will be definitely in touch with you, Michael. I'm also working on a book project on the same very topic on COVID-19, its impact on teaching and learning under Ruth Lees, Taylor and Francis. So as a scholar in the program, would you tell my students, scholar in the program, how to be productive, how you were able to write and publish 25 manuscripts and one with the co-author, the rest of them are just single author? What is the secret sauce or the magic behind this creativity, collaboration, production?
Oh, well, I have to admit, I wasn't prepared for this, for this question. As far as kind of my writing practice, one thing that I did was I bought a big stack of index cards, and whenever I thought I had an idea about something, I would just kind of sketch it out. What's the main idea? What kind of research would be required to explore this question? Maybe are there any sources or debates that this research question links into? And then about 50% of the time, once I saw it written down, I would realize that it was going to be a waste of my time. So I would throw it out. But then I think the practice of doing that, of writing down how arguments fit together, how research projects fit together, and also evaluating them, means that you're able to kind of streamline that process, and you already have kind of a structure. And when you approach writing and the structure is already there, then it's not so much a matter of approaching an empty canvas and looking for inspiration. Instead, you're just kind of filling in gaps. I found that helped with, everyone I think deals with writing anxiety to one degree or another. And for me, having that structure that's there from the very beginning of posing the research question makes it a lot less of a scary process when you get to writing it at the end of the research, because you've had that structure there all along, and you're familiar with that structure. And I find that helps with if you say I have half an hour or 45 minutes in the morning when I can write on a particular project, then I just look for a section within a particular structure that I say, okay, well, that's a small section. I can work on that small section today, or I can work on half of a larger section, write a couple of paragraphs that will fill in this particular part. And again, because I came to the research question with a structure kind of already, in posing the research question, writing up what that structure would look like, then it's easier to follow along and make that incremental, but consistent incremental progress along the way.
Awesome. Thank you so much. You are an exemplary scholars for many of our students, no matter wherever they are. In my programs, since we have many doctoral students, they are highly encouraged to write and publish. And this is also one of the expectation is a doctoral students. And you are, really, really amazing. And I was super impressed. And also, thank you so much for accepting my invitation and willing to speak with my fellow colleagues. Hopefully we'll be collaborating, writing together. Maybe at this moment, let's take maybe 1 or 2 questions. I know we are almost top of the hour as we have a schedule. So the scholars, please unmute microphone if you have 1 or 2 burning questions. And I have shared the Michael's publications from the Google Scholars, and you can see number of article published, cited. and also the year of publications. So please take a look, the link that I shared in the chat room. And Michael is here. He's a great example of how, he was taking a lead on publications. Right now he's a single author. It was super impressive work. Okay, back to you, students. If you have questions, please unmute microphone.
I don't have a question. I just wanted to thank Michael for stopping by and sharing his lecture with us.
Thank you, Michael, again. Appreciated